When war erupted in September 1939, Britain stood against a storm it was barely prepared to face. The Royal Air Force, born only 2 decades earlier, entered the Second World War with courage but little clarity. Its leaders believed in the bomber's promising that the bomber will always get through. But belief would soon collide with the brutal arithmetic of war. In those first months, the RAF's Bomber Command targeted German naval bases, industrial zones, and communication lines in daylight raids. The logic seemed sound. Clear skies meant visibility, visibility meant accuracy. But the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. Within weeks, losses piled up. Heinkel and Messerschmitt fighters tore into unescorted British bombers. Dozens failed to return. Crews vanished without trace, replaced by telegrams delivered to quiet English streets. By late 1939, daylight raids had proven suicidal. British strategists faced a bitter choice: abandon bombing altogether, or hide in the darkness. The night offered safety but also blindness. A bomber could fly unseen, yes, but how could it strike what it couldn't see? The early attempts were dismal. Crews sent to hit strategic factories often missed their targets by miles. Some never even reached Germany, lost to weather, mechanical failures, or disorientation. A 1941 investigation later revealed that only 1 in 10 bombers dropped its load within 5 miles of the intended target. To the public, night bombing was still war. To the crews, it was guesswork in the dark. Yet Britain could not stop. After the fall of France in 1940, the island stood alone. The Luftwaffe's blitz rained destruction on London, Coventry, and countless others. Entire neighborhoods vanished under incendiary storms. As fire brigades fought through the rubble, voices within the Air Ministry hardened. If Germany could burn Britain's cities, Britain would return the fire. But to do that, it needed more than courage. It needed technology and leadership willing to gamble on untested ideas. In 1941, a new figure took command of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris. Stern, blunt, and unyielding, Harris believed in one thing above all: that destroying Germany's industrial heartland could shorten the war. To him, night bombing wasn't failure. It was evolution. He famously declared, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." Under his direction, Bomber Command began to rebuild, not just its aircraft, but its doctrine. Scientists worked feverishly to develop radar and navigational aids that could pierce the dark. A radio navigation system, allowed bombers to fix their position with unprecedented accuracy. Soon came oboe, using ground signals to guide pathfinders to exact points above enemy territory. But equipment alone wouldn't win the night. The aircraft themselves were the problem. Britain's early bombers, the Handley, Page, Hampton, Whitley, and Wellington, were small, slow, and short-ranged. They could barely carry enough explosives to dent the factories they targeted. Something new had to be born. Something larger, stronger, and capable of carrying the war deep into Germany. That task fell to Avro, one of Britain's most innovative aircraft manufacturers. But their first attempt, the twin-engine Avro Manchester, was a disaster. Underpowered and unreliable, it became infamous for engine failures mid-flight. Crews nicknamed it the Widowmaker. Production halted after barely 200 units. Yet in failure lay opportunity. Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, refused to give up. He saw what the Manchester could be if freed from its constraints. He redesigned its frame, replacing the 2 unreliable Vulture engines with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, the same engines that powered the Spitfire. He expanded the bomb bay, strengthened the wings, and refined its aerodynamics. By 1942, a new prototype was ready. It looked imposing, broad-winged, long-bodied, with a quiet grace that hid its destructive potential. The test pilots returned glowing reports: faster, steadier, and capable of carrying twice the payload of its predecessors. The Avro Lancaster was born. Would take months before the world realized what that meant: that this single aircraft would turn Britain's doubts into dominance and make the darkness itself a weapon. The old question, when was night bombing useless, was about to meet its answer in fire and steel. By the spring of 1942, the Royal Air Force was transforming. The Lancaster had entered squadron service, and Bomber Command was preparing for a new phase of war. One fought not under the sun, but beneath the cover of darkness. The British knew that they could not outfight the Luftwaffe in daylight. What they could do was outlast it, disrupt its factories, its oil, its will to continue. The night would be their shield and the Lancaster their sword, but first the shield needed sharpening. To navigate the endless black over occupied Europe, crews needed precision tools. G allowed them to plot their position using radio pulses from Britain, a revolution in navigation accuracy. But its range was limited. Soon came oboe, a system that could guide a bomber to a target within a few hundred yards. And in 1943, a new secret arrived, H2S, the world's first airborne radar. Mounted in a dome beneath the Lancaster's belly, it could read the ground below, painting rivers, coastlines, and cities as ghostly shapes on a radar screen. The night skies of Europe were no longer blind. The combination of these systems turned Bomber Command into something entirely new, a precision force operating in darkness. But the moral and strategic questions grew louder. Could industrial destruction alone defeat Germany? And at what cost? For Sir Arthur Harris, there was no hesitation. He believed that breaking the German industrial machine would break the German spirit. He concentrated the bombers, creating what he called the 1,000-bomber raids. The first struck Cologne on May 30, 1942. Nearly 1,047 aircraft, Wellingtons, Halifaxes, and the new Lancasters crossed the Channel in waves. The scale was staggering. The city burned for days. The message was clear. Britain had found its vengeance in the night. The Germans were shocked. They had believed their homeland secure. Now air raid sirens wailed nightly across the Reich. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied, searchlights swept the skies, and radar stations sprang up across Europe. The battle between bomber and defender was no longer about range or speed. It was about perception, light, and invisibility. As Bomber Command refined its craft, so too did its enemy. The Luftwaffe Nachtjäger, the night fighter arm, was born under commanders like Josef Kammhuber. His network of radar-guided interception zones, the Kammhuber Line, stretched from Denmark to France. Each sector had searchlights, flak batteries, and twin-engine night fighters armed with cannon. Every mission became a deadly chess game. Crews had to navigate through corridors of flak, radio interference, and radar traps, all while maintaining silence and formation. The Lancaster's design proved crucial here. Its powerful engines gave it stability even when damaged. Its wide bomb bay could carry not just high-explosive bombs, but specialized payloads from 4,000-pound cookies to the 12,000-pound tall boys that would later shatter. Bunkers and viaducts, it was a machine, built for endurance and meant for terror. Inside Britain, factories worked around the clock. At Avro's plant in Manchester, women riveters and engineers labored by lamplight, piecing together the steel skeletons that would soon darken German skies. The Lancaster became more than a bomber. It was an industrial miracle, a symbol of national resolve. But its introduction did not end the losses. Each mission tested the limits of courage. The average life expectancy of a Lancaster crew was 21 operations. Out of 125,000 air crew who served in Bomber Command, over 55,000 were killed, one of the highest casualty rates of any Allied branch. Every mission was a coin toss with death. Still, the men flew. Because each flight meant more than survival. It meant purpose. It meant fighting back when the world had once seemed lost. By late 1942, the Lancaster had become the centerpiece of Britain's air war. It was fast enough to evade most fighters, powerful enough to carry Britain's heaviest bombs, and reliable enough to return home on 3 engines, sometimes even 2, and with each raid, its legend grew. Cities like Essen, Bremen, and Hamburg would soon feel its thunder. German intelligence began referring to it as Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. But the coming year, 1943, would decide whether Harris's vision could truly cripple Germany, or whether the cost in British lives would make victory indistinguishable from tragedy. The stage was set for a campaign that would define not only the Lancasters' legacy but the moral boundaries of war itself. Each Lancaster carried 7 men, 7 lives bound by 1 machine, 1 mission, and 1 night sky. The crew composition was fixed: pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, mid-upper gunner, and tail gunner. They were often barely out of their teens. Some had never flown before the war, yet each man depended on the others with absolute trust. Before a mission, they would gather in briefing rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps stretched across the walls, strings marking routes over occupied Europe. The target would be named Essen, Hamburg, Berlin, and for a moment silence always followed. Everyone knew what those names meant. After takeoff, the world shrank to the dull red glow of the cockpit and the endless drone of the Merlins. The cold seeped into their bones. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks froze, fingers stiffened, and conversation became fragments over the intercom. Each man performed his role in ritual precision. The navigator traced coordinates on a dim chart. The bomb aimer lay prone in the nose, peering through the bomb sight. The tail gunner sat isolated, enclosed in a transparent turret, the loneliest seat in the sky. They couldn't see each other, but they trusted each other completely. And every night as flak lit up the darkness and German fighters closed in, that trust meant survival. For many, fear became routine. Crews learned to ignore the ping of shrapnel on the fuselage or the muffled thud of shells exploding nearby. They joked about superstition, lucky socks, rituals before flight, a rabbit's foot hidden in a pocket. Yet each time they returned safely, they looked at the empty bunks in the barracks and understood how fragile luck was. The Lancaster demanded endurance, and it gave none in return. But to those who flew it, it wasn't just a bomber. It was home guardian and weapon, all in one. The Lancaster was not born perfect. It was forged through failure. Roy Chadwick's reimagined design transformed the underpowered Manchester into something extraordinary. The secret lay in balance. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines providing more than 6,000 total horsepower, a vast bomb bay that could hold nearly 14,000 pounds of ordnance, and a frame strong enough to absorb punishment that would cripple other bombers. Its design was simple yet elegant. A mid-wing configuration gave it stability and lift. The narrow fuselage reduced drag. The twin tail fins improved control at high altitudes. Crews praised its responsiveness. It handled like a fighter despite its size. In emergencies, a skilled pilot could coax it home on 2 engines even with severe damage. But what made the Lancaster revolutionary was its versatility. Its bomb bay could accommodate nearly any payload. From 1,000-pound high explosives to blockbusters that could level entire streets, it became the most adaptable bomber of the war. The later introduction of specialized bombs, like Barnes-Wallace's, Tallboy and Grand Slam, turned the Lancaster into a siege weapon capable of shattering fortified U-boat pens and underground factories. Its range exceeded 2,500 kilometers, allowing it to reach the industrial core of Germany and return safely. And unlike its predecessors, it carried a full crew with relative comfort, enough space for movement, heaters for long flights, and visibility that made night navigation possible. Technologically, it represented the peak of British wartime engineering. It wasn't the fastest or the most heavily armed, but it was the most balanced. The aircraft that could do everything required of it and survive to fly again. It was, as one pilot later said, the only aircraft that gave us a fighting chance. Night bombing was not chaos, and it was choreography. Beneath the apparent randomness of black skies and scattered lights lay a system of precision, coordination, and nerve. Each mission began with pathfinders, elite crews trained to locate and mark targets with flares. Using the latest radar systems and oboe guidance, they flew ahead of the main force, often alone and vulnerable. Their success determined whether the rest of the bombers would strike steelworks or farmland. Following them came the main bomber stream, hundreds of Lancasters flying within a narrow corridor of sky, each separated by seconds. The concentration overwhelmed German radar and defenses. Instead of isolated targets, the Luftwaffe faced a flood of aircraft too numerous to intercept individually. Communication was minimal. Radio silence was critical to avoid detection. Crews relied on timing, discipline, and instinct. Below them, German cities were blacked out. Entire skylines vanished, leaving only the faint reflections of moonlight on rivers or rail lines. When the green target markers appeared through the clouds, the bomb aimers began their deadly calculations. Altitude, wind drift, airspeed, all converted into seconds of release. Once the bombs fell, the aircraft veered sharply to avoid the shock waves and the rising columns of flame. Every stage demanded precision under impossible stress. A miscalculated heading could send a Lancaster into another's flight path. A late turn could mean drifting into a flak concentration. And yet it worked. The RAF developed a rhythm to the night, a deadly orchestration that slowly suffocated German industry. For the men of Bomber Command, success was measured not in glory, but in return. One more mission survived, one more dawn seen. And soon those missions would bring the war to the very edge of Germany's heart, cities that had never before known what true darkness could hide. To the people of Germany, the night became something to fear. By 1943, air raid sirens echoed almost nightly. The first distant hum of engines over the horizon sent families racing toward shelters and basements. Children clutched gas masks. Mothers carried bundles of documents and photographs, fragments of lives they might not see again by morning. The German defenses, once formidable in daylight, struggled in the dark. The Kammhuber Line, a network of radar-guided interception zones, tried to impose order on the chaos. Searchlights swept the skies in blinding cones, linking with flak batteries below and night fighters above. Twin-engine Messerschmitts and Junkers prowled through the gloom, guided by radar operators who watched for ghostly echoes on their screens. But the Lancaster formations came in waves so dense that the system overloaded. The German night fighters could only attack a fraction of them. For every bomber destroyed, dozens reached their targets. The defenders called it the Bomberstrom, the bomber stream, a river of flame that no line could stop. Still, the German airmen adapted. They developed deadly tactics like schräge Musik, upward-firing cannons mounted inside night fighters that allowed them to attack unseen from below. A single burst could ignite a bomber's fuel tanks, turning it into a fireball before the crew even knew they were under attack. The cat-and-mouse struggle in the dark reached a terrifying intensity. Radio transmissions filled with code words and cries for help. German pilots reported seeing entire skies flicker with explosions. A storm of burning stars. For the civilians below, there was no defense. Even cities far from the front lines, Hamburg, Kassel, Dresden, lived in constant dread. Every night the question was the same. Would it be us this time? The once proud Reich had learned a truth Britain had already endured. That war from the air erases the boundary between front line and home. Inside Britain, the success of the Lancaster brought triumph, but also unease. For the first time, the RAF could strike deep into the Reich. But it also meant something darker. Civilian casualties on a scale unseen in history. Officially, the targets were industrial, steelworks, oil refineries, shipyards. In reality, the concept of area bombing blurred every line. Harris believed the destruction of entire urban centers would break the enemy's morale and cripple production. The aim, he said, is the destruction of the German workers' home, factory, and transport system. To some in government, it was ruthless but necessary. To others, it was morally unbearable. Critics inside the RAF questioned whether terror from the sky could truly bring victory. British intelligence estimated that German industrial output, though disrupted, continued to grow through 1943. Yet for every doubt, there was another city burning, evidence that Harris's whirlwind was real. Among the crews, the debate rarely reached the cockpit. They flew because that was their duty. The ethics of war were for politicians. Their mission was survival and execution, to reach the target, drop the bombs, and bring their men home. Still, some pilots admitted later that they could feel the unease creeping in. They saw the glow of cities beneath them, the reflection of flames rising through cloud cover. One navigator recalled, from 20,000 feet you could see half a continent burning. It didn't feel like war anymore. It felt like something else. History would remember this paradox, that the Lancaster represented both the finest engineering of its age and one of its deepest moral shadows. The Lancaster was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of fear. Its deep throbbing engine note, the synchronized rhythm of 4 Merlins, became instantly recognizable to those below. Germans called it the death hum. To Allied airmen, the sound meant protection, power, and unity. To German civilians, it meant the world was about to end again. Entire cities developed psychological scars. Children drew pictures of black planes and orange fire. Propaganda posters urged civilians to stay strong, but morale cracked under the endless repetition of raids. By 1943, Even seasoned German commanders admitted the psychological toll was immense. Reich Minister Albert Speer wrote that the air war had become the nightmare of the German people. Workers slept in shelters. Production slowed and transport networks collapsed under debris and fire. The impact rippled beyond destruction. It forced Germany to divert vast resources to defense. Thousands of guns, millions of tons of concrete, and tens of thousands of men who might otherwise have fought at the front. And for the men of Bomber Command, that knowledge carried weight. Every night they took off knowing that fear itself was part of their mission. The Lancaster, more than any other aircraft, made the dark skies over Europe a battlefield of nerves. It fought not only with explosives but with sound, persistence, and inevitability. As 1943 drew to its midpoint, the stage was set for the moment when all of these forces, technology, fear, and belief, would converge in one of the most daring operations of the war. A mission that would show the world exactly what the Lancaster could do when unleashed with precision. The Dambusters raid. Operation Chastise, May 16-17, 1943. The night of May 16, 1943, began like countless others at RAF Scampton. The crews of No. 617 Squadron gathered in tense silence as Wing Commander Guy Gibson briefed them on a mission unlike anything they had ever flown. The target: 3 massive dams in Germany's Ruhr Valley, the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe. These were no ordinary structures. They were the beating heart of German industry, feeding water and power to steelworks and factories across the region. Destroy them and the Reich's war machine would stagger, but the task bordered on impossible. The dams were heavily defended, their walls thick enough to absorb direct hits. Traditional bombing had failed before. What the crews didn't yet know was that their weapon was equally unconventional. A top-secret device designed by engineer Barnes Wallace, known only as the bouncing bomb. It looked more like a steel barrel than a bomb. Designed to skip across the surface of the water like a stone, it would hit the dam wall, sink, and detonate at a precise depth to unleash maximum hydraulic force. But to work, it required perfect conditions. Speed, height, distance, and timing all had to align within seconds. The Lancasters were stripped of armor to reduce weight. Each carried a single bouncing bomb slung beneath its belly. Spotlights were mounted to measure altitude. The aircraft had to fly at exactly 60 feet, barely twice the wingspan of the plane itself, while maintaining a speed of 232 miles per hour. One mistake, one gust of wind, and the bomber would strike the water and disintegrate. At 21:28 hours, the first wave of Lancasters lifted off into the dusk. Their engines thundered across Lincolnshire fields, fading into the night. They flew low, dangerously low, across the Dutch coast, skimming treetops and power lines to avoid radar. The moonlight glinted off rivers and canals as they crossed into enemy territory. German defenses were caught off guard. The radar operators expected bombers at high altitude, not skimming the surface. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the dark as the formation weaved through valleys and over hills. One Lancaster clipped a power line and crashed in flames. Another was lost to flak. Yet the rest pressed on. Shortly after midnight, Gibson's Lancaster reached the Möhne Dam. The moonlight revealed its immense structure, 40 meters high, 50 meters long, surrounded by searchlights and flak batteries. Gibson lined up the attack run. The crew held their breath as the altimeter steadied. The bomb aimer's voice came through the intercom. Steady. Steady, left a bit. Steady. At exactly 60 feet, the bomb released. It bounced across the water, once, twice, 3 times, and struck the wall. A second later, an underwater explosion sent a towering plume skyward. When the spray cleared, the dam still stood. Gibson circled back, drawing enemy fire to protect the next aircraft. One by one, the Lancasters came in, each flight through the same gauntlet of flak and tracers. Finally, on the 5th run, Pilot Officer David Maltby's bomb struck perfectly. The water shimmered, paused, then burst through the cracked wall in a torrent. The Möhne Dam collapsed, unleashing millions of tons of water into the valley below. Entire villages were swept away. Moments later, Gibson led the surviving bombers toward the Eder Dam. The terrain was even worse. Steep hills, narrow approaches, and treacherous air currents. 2 aircraft crashed attempting to line up, But squadron leader Henry Maudsley and pilot officer Les Knight persevered. Knight's bomb struck true. The Eater Dam gave way in a thunderous roar. By dawn, the Ruhr Valley lay drowning under a flood that crippled factories, railways, and power stations. The raid had succeeded beyond expectation, but at a terrible cost. Of the 133 men who took off, 53 were killed and 3 captured. Back in England, the survivors landed to the rising sun. Exhausted, silent, and hollow-eyed, they had no sense of triumph, only disbelief. They had seen what precision, courage, and the Lancasters' power could achieve when combined. News of the raid electrified Britain. For the first time in years, the public felt that the darkness over Europe was turning in their favor. Newspapers hailed the crews as heroes. The Germans called it an act of engineering genius, and a warning of what was coming. The Dambusters raid was not just a victory of arms, but of imagination. It proved that with the right machine, even the impossible could be done. And now, Bomber Command would turn that same machine towards something far larger. Not one dam, but entire cities. By midsummer 1943, Britain had tasted the power of precision. But the war had not yet shifted. The Germans still occupied Europe. Their factories still poured steel, fuel, and weapons into the front lines. The Allies needed more than a raid. They needed a message. That message came in July, its name, Operation Gomorrah. It was the code name for a joint Anglo-American assault on the German port city of Hamburg, one of the largest industrial hubs in the Reich. The objective wasn't just to cripple production, but to break morale, to shake Germany's faith in its own invincibility. For this, Bomber Command unleashed its full strength. Nearly 800 aircraft, most of them Lancasters, would strike in waves, supported by new radar countermeasures and incendiary weaponry. The Americans would attack by day, the RAF by night. What made Gomorrah different wasn't just its scale. It was its science. British scientists had developed a secret tool called window, strips of aluminum foil cut to confuse German radar. Dropped by the thousands, these strips created a storm of false echoes, blinding Luftwaffe defenses. For the first time, the bombers would have a real chance of reaching their targets intact. On the night of July 24, 1943, the first wave took off from England. Among them were more than 700 Lancasters loaded with high explosives and incendiary bombs, designed not only to shatter buildings but to set entire districts ablaze. As the Armada crossed the North Sea, the German radar screens flickered with meaningless noise. Controllers in Hamburg's air defense network stared in confusion. The skies looked full of ghosts. By the time sirens wailed, the first bombs were already falling. The city below was peaceful moments before, children sleeping, factory whistles quiet, the hum of summer crickets. Then the sky erupted. Lancasters flew in formation, their bomb bays glowing red as payloads dropped in rhythmic waves. Each aircraft carried a mix of high explosives, to rip open roofs, and incendiaries, to ignite what lay beneath. The result was catastrophic precision. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The phosphorus bombs ignited timber beams and fuel lines, and the heat began to feed on itself. Temperatures climbed past 800 degrees C. Oxygen was sucked from the streets as winds gathered into something unnatural, a firestorm. Witnesses described it as if the earth itself had turned to flame. The air roared like a hurricane, pulling people from shelters, melting asphalt, turning glass into liquid. Trees burst into fireballs without contact. The wind speed reached 150 mph, enough to fling debris and bodies alike. From above, the bomber crews watched in stunned silence. Even through miles of smoke, they could see the inferno spreading, a sea of orange and red that swallowed the city whole. One gunner wrote later, "It was as if we had opened the gates of hell." By dawn, half of Hamburg was gone. More than 40,000 civilians lay dead, and hundreds of thousands were homeless. Factories, shipyards, refineries, all reduced to ash. And yet the cost to the RAF was astonishingly low. Thanks to window, only 12 aircraft were lost that night, a fraction of the usual toll. It marked a turning point in air warfare. For the first time, technology and firepower had combined to create destruction on an industrial scale. A new kind of warfare, fought not with bullets but with the sky itself. When the American daylight raids followed, the city was already a skeleton. Thick columns of smoke rose 5 miles high, visible from hundreds of kilometers away. The fires burned for 10 days. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Hamburg has suffered a catastrophe. The people's morale has collapsed. It is the greatest crisis since the war began." But in London, Churchill's war cabinet saw more than vengeance. They saw proof that strategic bombing worked, that the Lancaster and its crews could break the back of Nazi industry. The firestorm over Hamburg was a terrible triumph, a new phase of total war that blurred the line between soldiers and civilians. To the men of Bomber Command, it was both victory and burden. Many returned home to applause, others to silence. They had done their duty, but they had seen what their duty had become. As one pilot wrote in his logbook, "We are not heroes. We are instruments. The fire we drop is larger than us all." Hamburg burned for days, but the lessons it taught would shape every mission that followed, because from that night on, the Lancaster was no longer just an aircraft. It was the weapon that turned the tide of a continent. The morning after Hamburg was gray, silent, and unrecognizable. From the air, reconnaissance photographs showed nothing but blackened grids where streets had once run. The city that had been one of Germany's proudest ports, its warehouses, shipyards, and oil refineries, now lay in ruins. But beneath that ruin, the world of warfare had changed. The success of Operation Gomorrah proved something Bomber Command had fought for since the dark days of 1940. That strategic night bombing could cripple an industrial power. For Britain, it was more than vindication. It was transformation. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, once criticized for his ruthless persistence, was now vindicated. The Lancaster had done what earlier aircraft could not: strike deep into the heart of the Reich, hit accurately, and come home again. The once ridiculed doctrine of dehousing enemy workers, destroying the homes and infrastructure that sustained German industry, was now official strategy. Production of the Lancaster soared. British factories, powered by thousands of women on the home front, worked day and night to build them. By war's end, over 7,300 Lancasters would roll from assembly lines, each carrying the same cold purpose: to bring the war to Germany's doorstep. But victory had a cost, and it wasn't measured only in steel or numbers. Every mission came with a staggering risk. A bomber crewman's life expectancy remained painfully short. Only 1 in 3 would survive a full tour. Many were still barely out of their teens. For every city that burned, dozens of Lancasters failed to return. The searchlights and flak, though momentarily blinded by window, evolved and adapted. Germany learned, countered, and fought back harder each month. Hamburg was followed by Berlin, Cologne, Essen, Nuremberg, each name becoming a symbol of fire and loss. And yet the RAF pressed on, because by now there was no turning back. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. In Germany, the myth of invulnerability had been shattered. Civilians who had once cheered Hitler's triumphs now faced nightly terror. Entire neighborhoods moved underground, children slept in shelters, and faith in the regime began to erode. The propaganda ministry tried to conceal the devastation, but word spread faster than censorship could contain. In Britain, news of Hamburg's destruction was received with mixed emotions. Newspapers called it just retribution, yet in private, some officials feared what it meant: that modern war had crossed a threshold it could never return from. Even Harris himself, though unflinching in public, understood the terrible power his command had unleashed. He told Churchill, "There are no morals in warfare, but I sometimes wonder what we are becoming." Still, Bomber Command's momentum grew. With the arrival of the Pathfinder Force, target marking improved dramatically. Cities could now be hit with chilling precision. Rail lines, power plants, submarine pens, and weapon factories were systematically erased. The Allies' faith in strategic bombing was now absolute. The Lancaster stood at the center of that belief, a symbol of engineering excellence, endurance, and destruction. Yet even amid these advances, the human reality never faded. Each successful mission was written in smoke and sacrifice. Every bomb dropped had names attached to it: the men who carried it, the civilians beneath it, and the engineers who built it. The world was learning that the sky could no longer be a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, one where courage and consequence burned together. But even after Hamburg, the war wasn't over. Greater challenges loomed ahead: stronger defenses, longer missions, and the moral question that would shadow every bomber crew until the very end. Because if Hamburg had proven that night bombing could work, what came next would test whether humanity could still live with what it had created. As 1944 dawned, the Lancaster had become the backbone of Britain's aerial offensive. Each night, the black silhouettes lifted off from English airfields, thousands of engines roaring like a single living thing. Their mission? To dismantle the Third Reich from the sky. But beyond tactics and tonnage, something deeper was happening. The war in the air was evolving, and so was its conscience. When the bombing campaign turned toward Berlin, the Lancaster faced its greatest trial yet. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Bomber Command launched 16 massive raids on the German capital. The operation became known as the Battle of Berlin, a campaign Harris believed could bring Germany to her knees. For the crews, it was a nightmare of endurance. Flights lasted up to 9 hours through frozen altitudes under constant radar-guided flak and night fighter pursuit. The Luftwaffe had regrouped, deploying elite interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Ju-88s equipped with deadly upward-firing cannons. In those months, more than 1,000 Lancasters were lost, and with them nearly 7,000 men. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Pilots who survived often came home to find their bunks empty, their friends gone. Yet even as the losses mounted, the campaign revealed something fundamental: the resilience of the Allied will. The RAF didn't retreat. It adapted. Crews learned new evasion routes, new altitudes, new formations. Tactics evolved with every loss. And through that brutal learning came mastery. By mid-1944, Bomber Command's precision had sharpened dramatically. Using radar aids like H2S and improved Pathfinder techniques, the Lancasters began striking key targets: oil refineries, free weapon sites, and rail junctions. Critical to German logistics, the culmination of this precision came with Operation Chastise, the legendary Dambusters raid of May 1943, and where specially modified Lancasters breached Germany's great dams using Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bombs. It was part engineering genius, part reckless courage, and wholly symbolic. The images of cascading floodwaters sweeping through the Ruhr Valley became icons of ingenuity and defiance. But after every operation, after every city reduced to ash, the question grew louder: was it victory or vengeance? In Britain, debate stirred. Voices within Parliament, clergy, and even among veterans began to question whether entire civilian centers should remain targets. The war was being won, but at a human price too vast to measure. Harris, unwavering, defended his campaign to the end. The Nazis sowed the wind, he said, and now they are reaping the whirlwind. To him, the destruction was not cruelty, but necessity, the only way to break a machine built on tyranny. By the war's close in May 1945, Bomber Command had flown 364,000 sorties and dropped over 1 million tons of bombs. More than 55,000 British airmen, nearly half of all who served, never returned. The Lancaster, though victorious, carried more ghosts than any aircraft in history. When the surviving crews finally came home, there were no parades, no grand speeches, just quiet men walking back into civilian life, haunted by what they had seen and done. Yet history would not forget them. The Lancaster's roar had not only shaken cities, it had reshaped warfare itself. It proved that air power could decide wars, that courage could exist in the unseen dark, and that even in total war, humanity could still question the weight of its own victories. And as the smoke cleared over Europe, one truth remained: the men who flew the Lancaster had changed the course of the 20th century. But they had also forever changed what it meant to fight. The skies were no longer symbols of freedom. They had become mirrors, reflecting both the brilliance and the burden of man. And in that reflection, history found both its triumph and its tragedy. When the war finally ended, the world stood in silence, a silence louder than any bomb. Europe was a graveyard of cities. The ashes of Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin mixed with those of Coventry and London. Victory had been won, but not without a haunting cost. For the men of the Lancaster, peace felt unreal. They had flown through flak storms, seen cities turn to fire, watched comrades vanish in black clouds, and survived only by chance and courage. The cheers that greeted them back home were brief, almost uncertain. The world had moved on to celebrate freedom, but few wanted to remember what it had taken to secure it. The Avro Lancaster itself became a relic, a monument of iron and resolve. In museums it stands today with its bomb bay doors open, not in menace but in memory. It reminds us that power, once unleashed, can never truly be clean, that progress and destruction often share the same sky. Historians still debate the morality of Britain's bombing campaign, whether it hastened victory or simply deepened humanity's scars. But one truth is beyond argument. The Lancaster changed the nature of war. It turned the night into a weapon, transformed the sky into a battlefield, and forced the world to confront the terrible reach of modern technology. And yet, behind every ton of bombs, every sortie, every statistic, were the men, ordinary, frightened, resolute men, who carried the weight of a nation's hope on their shoulders. They were not symbols of destruction, but of endurance. They flew not for glory, but because the world had left them no choice. As dawn broke over Europe in 1945, the engines fell silent. For the first time in years, the night belonged to the stars again, and among them, unseen but eternal, lingered the spirits of those who never came home, the ones who proved that even in the darkest skies, courage can still burn brighter than fire.